All right, Tia. This has been a couple months in the making. I've been horrible with my email. I've been traveling for the last couple months. We were kind of catching up on that. But I just want to thank you so much for joining me on the You're Not Alone podcast today. And I'm super excited to have you on. Jenna and I were talking just a little bit about you beforehand, and I've had her on the podcast. So I felt like kindred spirits when I was going through your website and kind of reading a little bit about your story. And I always like to start off these episodes with you, giving you the opportunity to just give a quick introduction on yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Tia. I come from Utah. It's where I was born and raised. I am a creative. I love to do anything with art. So that's painting, collaging, really just anything. I've been stopped by airport security more times than I can count for having too many hot glue guns in my bag. I love anything crafty, and also anything in the water. So kayaking, swimming, and really my main passion is people. I love to do anything where I'm getting to know someone, getting to know their story. I do a lot of advocacy for OCD and ADHD and mental health as a whole, and love to talk about the idea of stepping outside of the black and white frameworks, which we exist in society, and kind of trying to live with
Yes.
a little bit more nuance. That's my favorite thing to talk about. And then I run support groups for NOCD, so kind of focusing on OCD and co-occurring conditions like ADHD, and getting to facilitate those groups is something I love to do.
Yeah. You said a lot of things there that like came to mind for me, like people being your passion.
Hmm.
Love that. I feel the same exact way. Anything that has to do with water. I love the water.
Yeah,
Um, but now I live in California and the Pacific absolutely terrifies me. The waves are huge.
really.
Yes. And I still get in and I swim and I like try. I know on your website you talk about the importance of facing your fears. And anybody who has OCD understands that the only way out is through and you have to face your fears. So I still get in the Pacific and I still swim, but I have the utmost respect for water now because I
Yeah.
realized how powerful water is. It's so powerful.
It's a humbling experience. It's when you're in the waves like that and you just are recognizing how small you are in comparison. I used to live out in Hawaii, and there were so many nights where I just would sit and watch the ocean and just be kind of terrified by how massive and
Yes,
all-consuming it is.
it is. And like, you don't understand the power of a 6 foot wave. Like, you're like, oh, it's a 6 foot wave. Like,
Right.
that's nothing. And then you're in a 6 foot wave and you're like, wow,
Yeah,
this is a very powerful force. Like, this can, if I'm not proficient at swimming, like this could be the end of me. You know what I mean? It's
totally.
yeah. So even
Totally.
in Hawaii, the waves are much bigger than 6 feet too. Like they're like
Yeah.
10, 15 footers, right? Like they're
Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
huge.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
massive. So that was something that just stuck out with me. And then I love that you love talking about nuance. And I think
Hmm.
in today's world, talking about nuance has never been more important. And
Right.
whether you have OCD or not, living in those areas of gray, things aren't just black and white. They're not just one way or the other. And there's no sort of middle ground. And I really, really want to talk to you about that. I think that's going to be a core component of our conversation today. I
For
like to
sure.
let things flow naturally, but I have a feeling that that's where we're going to go. But I did want to touch on your advocacy, working for NOCD, and then really your journey of living with OCD and ADHD and only getting diagnosed with it a few years ago.
Yeah.
So, can you kind of? I know when I was doing research on you, I went to your website and I was reading your story. But for those listeners that haven't done that yet, that background check, can you kind of start from the beginning and tell us a little bit about where your OCD journey began?
Totally. Yeah. So my first memory ever was a compulsion. It was me putting myself in timeout because I felt like I wasn't living up to the expectations my OCD had set for me. And a lot of those expectations came from, those kind of rules you grow up with as kids, being nice, being kind, that kind of structure.
Right.
A lot of that I grew up in a very high demand religion. And so it came often from that religious context of, be nice to people, do these things. And
Mm-hmm.
my OCD would take that to an extreme where it just felt exceptionally black and white. And that meant that if I even thought about doing something that I didn't perceive as good, then I was bad. And so I remember having the thought my brother was doing something obnoxious. I'm the oldest of five, and so I've got four little siblings, and my little brother was just doing something, and I was maybe only a couple years old. I was probably 4 and he was 2. And I remember thinking, like, having the little childlike urge of like, oh, I want to like hit him.
Yeah,
And, that's a child thing to do or to think.
definitely.
But
Yes.
because I thought it, even though I didn't, I felt so much guilt for the fact that I'd even thought to do that to my little brother that
Right.
I put myself in timeout for. It felt like hours as a kid. In reality, maybe it was 5 minutes, but I remember sitting there and intentionally trying to feel that guilt because to me,
Mm.
that's what it meant to be a good person, was to let yourself feel guilt all the time.
Yeah.
I thought that's what it meant. And so that was kind of my first memory and my earliest compulsion, again, being a really, really little kid, putting myself in timeout. And as the years went on, my OCD continued to grow and expand. I really don't think there's a subtype I've ever heard of that I didn't experience at some
Mm.
point. So,
Mm.
for those who know OCD can grab onto anything, and it definitely grabbed onto everything for me. So everything from, symmetry OCD, so how I was walking on the pavement and which feet I was stepping on the cracks with, to relationship OCD and feeling a whole lot of trepidation and fear around parents, and family members and siblings, and just feeling really cut off. And it spread into harm OCD and all of these different subtypes. And kind of my most predominant themes or types of OCD was the scrupulosity, which again was largely based in my religion. I like to say
Yeah.
it took religion and turned it into a cult in my mind. It just took things to an even farther black and white extreme.
Yeah.
Um, and then there was, the harm OCD, perfectionism, a lot of these things that just kind of took over my life. And when I was 13, I started getting really sick, just some really severe chronic illness stuff. I
Yeah.
honestly think a lot of it was triggered by the stress of, of all of this, all of these demands my brain was putting on me that I couldn't uphold.
Right.
Um, and it just kind of spiraled to a point where I remember, being in college and just not really being functioning anymore, not making it to any of my classes, not being able to leave my apartment, do the basic things like eating, showering, it just, everything felt inaccessible.
Mm.
And I kind of hit this rock bottom there where I had, you know, I'd been in an abusive relationship. I had just completely a loss of self. And
Yeah.
that's when I was able to be diagnosed with OCD, and get started with the ERP process, which was, as you mentioned, it's all about facing fears. It's all about saying, here's all the rules my OCD's placed on me. Let's see if we can bend them and then sit
Yeah.
with the distress so that I'm no longer ruled by them. And so there was a lot of bending those rules that happened for me, a lot of kind of leaning against the instinct I had, which was to run away, and leaning towards the distress and then getting good at sitting with it. And I experienced just a huge shift, just night and day difference. I was clinically severe, so they kind of scaled me out of 40. That's like the Y-box scale. I was a 37 out of 40. So really in this severe state. And by the time I left therapy, I was around a 7 out of 40,
Wow.
which is just a mild case. And now, 3 years later, I'm a 2 or 3 out of 40. So
Mm.
just drastically different, completely changed my life. And I that's when I realized there were still some areas of my life that weren't functioning and I couldn't figure out why. That's when I got diagnosed with ADHD, and also recognized the role complex PTSD had in my life, especially being a young kid with so much fear and shame. I had a lot of
write that down.
CPTSD, yeah. And was able to start working on those. And that's kind of where I'm at currently, is working a lot on the ADHD and the CPTSD. But yeah, I started doing a lot of advocacy work, just kind of sharing my story, talking about ERP, and finding that this was not a story that just related to individuals with OCD. A lot of people have lived in a black and white framework. A lot of people have relied on fear and shame as motivators. A lot of people have been held back in those ways. And so as I talked about it, I was able to find, community with not just people who have OCD, but just who want to step outside of that narrative and be able to live according to their values, and make decisions that are value driven and not fear and shame driven, which is something that we do a lot in society. I just started noticing the way it, played into so many decisions and so many thinking patterns in the world. And that's kind of how I got to where I am now, where I run support groups for OCD and talk about it a lot on my page. And yeah.
So I'm like a kid in a candy store right now. Every 2 seconds you were saying something where I was like, make a mental note of that. Make a mental note of that.
I mean, interrupt me. We can.
No, you were going, and I was just so. And I wrote the word enlightenment because it's amazing to me. People that go on, gosh, and this is okay. So this is going to sound stigmatizing at surface level, but let me put context behind it. OCD can be a superpower. Now, people say that sometimes because it's like, oh, you're a perfectionist. You like things neat and organized. Right. And people with OCD, they get very upset when people say that. And I always try to say, look, until you educate people, they don't know better, so they don't do better. They don't know better. They've never had OCD. Right. They've never done research on it. So, of course, at surface level, you're going to go, oh, you like things neat and tidy? Geez, I wish I was more like that. So that's not what I'm trying to say. Right. And for people listening that have said that before, that's okay. It's okay. We have those belief systems. When we don't know better, this is just things that we believe. No big deal. We just got to work on improving that belief system. Now, what I meant by superpower is when you are forced to get out of the black and white framework, when you are forced to live in areas of gray, when you are forced to face your fears, when you are forced to stop living from a guilt and shame based framework and pivot to a values based living framework, which we're going to unpack, there's this level of enlightenment that comes with it. When you go through that place, and I see this time and again with people who really do the work, that have OCD, and then they do the work and they recover, and we're going to talk about that recovery process. It just feels to me that they're slightly more enlightened, that there's this softness to them in terms of seeing the world a little differently. It's not so aggressive. It's not so everybody's my enemy. Everybody is either with me or against me, but more of like, hey, there's a lot of fear in the world. There's a lot of guilt in the world. There's a lot of people living like this. They might not even recognize that they're living like this because they haven't been forced to confront those thoughts the way that we are, because our world is always either contracting or expanding.
Totally.
Like if you become entangled in your thoughts with OCD, you are going to get to a place, like in your story, where you're simply not functioning. And that happened to me as well, because you get so caught up in the ritualizing and the compulsions and trying to do in your story, talking about, and I want to touch on the story a little bit more, but feeling the guilt as almost that sign that, okay, I am a good person, I'm doing the right thing, and being trapped in that. I'm curious because I do want to unpack all the different genres that you've experienced so that listeners can go, oh, hey, wait a second. I didn't think I had OCD because I don't have the traditional ones that people know about. But what she just said resonates with me. So I want to touch on that here in a second. Can you give an example, though, of somebody living in guilt and fear a guilt and fear framework that would be, again, without sounding stigmatizing here, but just for context, normal. Do you get what I'm trying to say there?
Yeah, just like an average Joe living in that framework.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, oh gosh, we see it everywhere. But we'll see it with people sticking to careers they don't love, because it's the safe bet. It's what they've been told they would do. It's what they've invested in. A lot of times people don't change their college majors even after they've decided they'd like to, because then it's the sunken cost fallacy. It's I just did all this work. I don't want to throw it all away, right? We see it with people who I always give the example of the common obsession and compulsion of having obsessions around relationships, wanting the perfect one or being scared of the perfect one. And so people do the compulsion of not dating or dating really poorly or, engaging in toxic dating behaviors, right?
Yep.
That's something we see a lot. And that's kind of, everyone can have obsessions, everyone can have compulsions, not everyone has OCD, but we see that framework of living in the fear and shame very often. People who don't pursue their passions because of the mental hurdles they have to getting there, or people who, I think one of the most classic examples of black and white thinking is political parties, right? We're often talking about the same thing. We're talking about the same problem. We want the same end result, but oftentimes people are so focused on what they think is the solution that no conversations are actually happening. People are existing in their own kind of echo chambers where one side is talking about this is the answer, one side is talking about this is the answer, and there's no conversations about how can we bridge this gap, how can we get to the same end goal, and oftentimes that is fear and shame driven, right? It's this idea of being so panicked about the outcome, about the end result, that you are wanting to put a Band-Aid on it instead of identifying the root cause. And so people will jump to these, we need to do this and we need to do this, before they get the chance to acknowledge what the problem is, before they get the chance to accept what the problem is and start to actually analyze it. So often, we see this all the time where people will jump to, we need this law, or we need this change, or we need to see this happen, before we've done the research about why is this problem happening to begin with? Have other countries experienced this? What have they done? We don't often hear these conversations. Like, we just hear, this is what I think should happen. And people, there's no room for discussion if we aren't discussing it, right?
This is so timely. My wife and I were just having this conversation actually right before this podcast interview. And I think so, cancel culture, obviously. And that, I believe, stems from, and you touched on this in your own story, the fear of wanting to be perceived as a good person, right? So we have a lot of people living within these frameworks, all in an attempt to be, and you talk about that outcome, the outcome being perceived as a good person, out of fear of being canceled for potentially saying the wrong thing. And what I loved about what you said is that if we could break down these echo chambers and come realizing that life is nuanced, there are areas of gray, that there's also a research component that we can bring into this, and that really what we need to be fueling is dialogue, I think is so important. And obviously the most recent shootings in Texas, and I'm going to now date this podcast, which I try to avoid as much as possible. I try to make them as timeless as possible, but people are mad, and it's completely understandable why people are upset. It's gut-wrenching and heartbreaking. But what happens, and my wife and I were talking about this, and I'm sure you know this through just how the brain functions, when we're angry, when we're coming from that fear, when we're coming from that guilt, when we're coming from anger, we really shut down the functioning of the CEO of the brain. We shut down that prefrontal cortex, which is the part that can see nuance, that can have dialogue, that can operate from a place of compromise. And when we are operating from that limbic fear-based system, everything becomes black and white, which is the extremes.
Right.
And so it becomes really difficult to move the needle because, to your point, everybody, I feel, kind of looks at things as it's either this or nothing at all.
Right.
And we we fall into those echo chambers like you were talking about. And
Right.
that's why I wanted to ask you about that, because I do feel, and do you know Elizabeth McInvale by chance?
I don't think so.
So she has OCD. Yeah, she is
Yeah.
literally one of the best people on the face of the planet. But she works for the McLean Institute in Houston. She has OCD. She's an advocate as well as a practitioner. Pretty big voice in the space, but she also talks about nuance, which is why when I saw that on your website, I was like, I think that this is a new movement. This is something that could be really important, because in my podcast interview with her, she was talking about nuance. She was like, and this was through the context of the pandemic, but talking about how important it is that people, again, not trying to stigmatize, but doing this for the sake of the conversation, normal people without OCD had to face uncertainty during the pandemic, and it really brought out these emotions that a lot of people maybe weren't totally familiar with, or maybe they'd been feeling them, but they didn't know what they were feeling, and now they were forced and kind of faced to feel it, and they didn't know how to respond to it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I feel like I need to be her friend. But
she's incredible. She's incredible. I'll connect you two after this interview.
Sounds great.
I've already decided that I like you a lot, and
well, thank you.
Yes, you are great. So, anyways, keep going.
But yeah, I think to me, this just the thing that keeps echoing in my head is acceptance. And I love talking about the idea of radical acceptance, because I think a lot of people think of acceptance as liking the situation, endorsing it, putting some sort of label, good or bad, on the situation, right? Acceptance just means acknowledging what the blunt reality is, and then how can we be effective given that? And a lot of times when people go into a problem, they don't start with the acceptance. They start with the solution. This is something I think OCD does in particular, but it'll be, here's this situation. Before I've accepted and let myself feel all that this situation is, I'm going to act out of that emotion and decide on something to fix the problem. But what ends up happening is we don't actually fix the problem, because we never got the chance to get to know what it was. We skipped past that part. We just jumped straight into what we could do about it, which means that we often aren't acting effectively. And this is something that people do all the time.
Right.
Where they'll have a situation. So let's go back to that example of, let's say someone's in school studying to be a lawyer, but they secretly love music, right?
I love that. Bringing it back to the creative side.
Yeah. So let's
sounds
say
like maybe this was a familiar circumstance for you.
Pretty much, right? But let's say they're in that state, and this whole time they're feeling really disappointed about like their law school. They just feel unmotivated. They're not really, doing well. They're just struggling. And if they aren't accepting all of the situation, what they might do is think there's something wrong with the way I'm approaching law, right? So they might go and invest more. They might go and get a lawyer tutor, so someone to come help them, right? They might go and get more resources. They might pay attention to their motivation. They might, maybe even get diagnosed with depression and figure out why they are experiencing so much distaste for law school. Like, why aren't they not motivated to do it? Right. Whereas when they accept the problem, they sit there, let themselves feel all they are feeling, and feel that, I'm feeling pulled in a different direction. And that's really hard for me, because I want to provide for a family, or I want to have this career that I've given so much to. And that's a really hard situation. I feel a lot of pressure, and they let themselves feel that in full. Then they can decide, now how can I be effective? And maybe they still decide to stay in law school, but maybe they decide that they're gonna, spend an extra day of the week, doing their music. Or maybe they decide that they are going to pursue the music. Or maybe they decide that they need to identify why they feel so much pressure to provide for a family, and that they can't do that with music, right? Like there's so much, it's a totally different problem that they're solving in that case, right? But because oftentimes people don't start with the acceptance, they don't start with the emotion, they don't start by acknowledging what they're feeling, they solve the wrong problem.
So that's interesting because anytime somebody approaches me that's struggling with OCD, I talk about radical acceptance as one of the concepts, because people always come to me and they're like, I hate these thoughts. I never want to feel
Yeah.
these or think these thoughts ever again. I never want to feel these emotions. I hate this. I hate that. How does one begin to cultivate radical acceptance?
Yeah. I think a lot of people think it's some sort of huge, overwhelming emotion of like, I accept. I'm just gonna wake
Right.
up in the morning and
Oh,
be
I'm
like,
open to
yes,
everything.
I
Yeah.
love this. I love having OCD. And no, it's
Yeah.
again, it's acknowledging what is, and that there's not anything that we can do to change what is, right? Um,
Meaning in this case, and I feel that this is what happened to me in my journey. So sorry to cut you off, but
no, 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 no. Yeah.
you gave me permission earlier. So I was like, well, I have this
Please
thought.
do.
Let me throw that
Please
out
do.
there. I distinctly remember the moment where I kind of shrugged my shoulders and I was like, I have OCD. Like I had gotten the
Yeah.
diagnosis and I was pissed off and frustrated and angry and in denial. Like, what is this OCD? Like, I didn't even know people could have this. And so I wasn't like accepting around the situation, and therefore I was solving the wrong problem. To your
Right.
point, I was
Yes.
doing everything else. Like, I need to find a job that actually makes me happy. Like, if I can do that, then that's going to make all this go away. And I distinctly remember the moment that I was sitting in the parking lot at my corporate job, and that's a completely other side conversation, which we can touch on, because I did end up getting out of that line of work. It was a part of the solution, but not the whole thing. And I was like, what you're doing isn't working, man. Like
Yeah.
you got diagnosed with OCD. Like is it the ideal situation? If you had to pick a path, is this a part of what you would pick? No, probably not. But this is, like you said, it's taking a step back and looking at what is. This
Yeah.
is the situation. So sorry not to cut you off, but I
No, no, I
distinctly remember that
appreciate that.
moment.
Yeah. Well, and I hear so many people when they're, coming, when they'll ask me for advice, or they'll come and seek OCD therapy. The first things they seek are, I need to stop these intrusive thoughts and I need to stop the distress. That is the problem,
Yeah.
right? That's the problem. And so unfortunately, because they think that's what the problem is, they're engaging in compulsions to stop them, right? They're trying to block out the thoughts. They're trying to do all these things. And those are not the problem. They've done a lot of studies with people who have OCD and people who don't have OCD. They had them all write down their intrusive thoughts for, a couple days. And then the psychologist looked at the different notes of these intrusive thoughts, and they could not tell who had OCD and who didn't, right?
Yeah.
The intrusive thoughts are not the problem.
It's
The
your
distress
relationship.
is not the problem, right? Like everyone
Exactly.
experiences the distress too. That's part of life. And that's something that actually can add more value to your emotional experience and depth. Like it's okay to have distress. Again, like you said, it's the relationship we have with it. It's what we do because of it. And so ERP is not about getting rid of the intrusive thoughts. It's not about getting rid of the distress. It's about learning to tolerate it and still be effective. It's about learning to say like, thank you. I acknowledge you're here in my car. I think the best example I can give of what acceptance has looked like for me is before OCD was driving my car. And I was just along for the ride.
Yeah.
And I hated it. And I did not like it. And I would always try to push OCD out of the car.
Yeah.
And inevitably that leads to crashing, right?
Yes.
I'd be trying to shove him out the door, like not accepting that it was there, and we would crash. But instead, as I went through the ERP experience, now it's kind of like OCD is this little backseat driver. I've acknowledged that it's going to be in my car, and it can, and it's going to kick the back of my chair, and it's going to be annoying.
And throw
but it
little,
doesn't get to touch the wheel.
Here, turn
right?
left here. This is the quick route.
Backseat driver.
Yeah, total backseat driver. I love this analogy.
But
this is great.
It doesn't get to touch the wheel, and it doesn't get to determine where I go. And I've accepted that it's there. I'm not going to try to turn around and push it out of my car. Yeah. It's there, and it's going to be there. And I don't like it. It's not fun, Yeah. But I also, I can't change it. And so all I get to change is what direction I turn. And that's something that I get to control. And so I think that's the beauty of acceptance, is you get to acknowledge what you can control and then acknowledge what you can't, and let it be there. You don't have to like it. You don't have to think it's awesome. You don't have to feel any type of magical acceptance feeling. You're just acknowledging it. You're no longer fighting against it. You're no longer pushing it out of the car or saying things like, I if I only didn't have OCD, my whole life would be better. Or as soon as I
Mm,
get this one thing, I will be happy. Or as soon as I, trying to doing the opposite of acceptance. I think acceptance is more passive than we sometimes think it is. It's more
it
about what we
is.
aren't doing
You're
than what
right.
we are, you know?
It's so true. That's so true. And I'll add to the traps. Another one is, and I get this DM all the time, Zach, I just want to get to a place where I'm like you, where I don't have intrusive thoughts anymore. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, time out,
Nope.
pause,
False.
got to DM this one back right away.
Right.
I have intrusive thoughts all the time.
All the time.
I'm not trying to get rid of my intrusive thoughts. Like you said, hey, come along, buddy. You're
Yeah.
welcome. You're kind of like, the like you said, the annoying backseat driver, but hey, you're here for the ride. You're with
Yeah.
me. Come along. And that is, I love that the acceptance is somewhat passive, because you're just kind of like, it's like the best way I describe it with people, it's like shrugging the shoulders. It's like, yeah, okay, I see you thought, that's fine. Like,
Yeah. You're
I
here.
guess maybe I could do that. I could not. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But like, maybe this would happen, maybe this wouldn't happen. I don't really know for sure. I guess in the realm of possibility, you know what I mean? Like, that type of dialogue is where I've gotten to with my brain, but it's very passive, and it's not this like very rigid, I can't have these thoughts anymore. I need
Right.
to get them to zero, which is honestly sometimes why I don't like to see. Sometimes there are people online that will advertise like, take my course and you'll never have an
Ugh.
intrusive thought again. And I'm like, man, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
That's trapping people, you know?
Yeah. No, 100%. And it's so freeing to stop fighting the uphill battle and just
So
acknowledge that
freeing.
it's there. I always give the example, and I don't remember where I heard this, but I give the example of like a really annoying political cousin who comes to Thanksgiving and just wants to chat
Just
and
wants to
just
talk
wants to tell you
politics.
all about their thoughts, and they're wrong, and
Yeah.
that they're getting their information from crazy sources, right?
Right, right.
And so you have choices. You can either engage with them and fight them and be like, that is not the case, let me disprove everything you're saying, I cannot believe you think that way, but you're
Right.
still wasting your Thanksgiving. Or
Yeah.
you can try to shove them out the door and insist that they aren't invited, and you're still wasting your Thanksgiving.
Right.
Or you can eat your turkey and you can let them be chatting, and you can just be like, well, that is a funny little thought that you have there, but again, I'm eating my turkey. And they might say, hey, what are your thoughts on this? And you're just like, isn't the stuffing good? Right?
I
And you just
love that you just
continue
said
to
that.
live
That's
your life, right? But it's all about how you're engaging. And I think a lot of people think that when you're pushing it out the door or fighting back, that you aren't engaging, but you are, right? Like that's the problem.
gosh, and I feel like we could literally pull the word OCD out of this and just apply this to communication skills in
Yeah.
society.
Yeah.
And goodness, I feel like we would potentially be a lot further along
Right.
with
Well,
some
and
of
it's accepting you're not going to change their mind. You're not going
right,
to make
right.
them
You're
have
not.
some realization. You're
No.
not going to get them to leave you alone. You're not going to get them to, they're just going to keep doing what they're going to do. And so all you get to determine is not their actions, but it's yours. It's how you engage, how you respond.
Driving the wheel, which is that values-based living that I want to touch on. So
Yeah.
fun little tangent there. I think that there are so many nuggets in there for everybody listening right now. So Tia, you've been a great guest so far. Thank you for coming on and being a wealth of knowledge. Let's talk different types of thoughts real quick.
Yeah.
So let's start with scrupulosity. So what does that kind of look like in your head, the cognitions, if you will?
Right. So scrupulosity is OCD that's primarily focused on moral obsessions. And so when I say morality, that's kind of based on your own framework of morality. So sometimes that's based on religion. Sometimes that's a secular morality. It's, whatever you view as moral. But for me, it was very much based in religion. And so it was taking these things, like, I'll give the example of, I was always taught, like, be respectful with your language, right? Like, don't go and cuss people out, right? That was essentially what I grew up being taught. And my brain would take it to this extreme. Well, I guess I'd hear that, and I'd also hear kind of run in the face of sin, right? Run away from sin, right? Don't engage with it.
Right.
And so I would take those thoughts, and my OCD would amplify them to the point where I'd hear someone else say a swear word, or even not even a swear word, even just a word that I viewed as kind of, not super polite,
inappropriate. Yeah.
inappropriate or not polite. And this is in junior high, I would sprint down the hall in the opposite direction because I thought I'm running in the face of sin.
Wow.
And I felt so embarrassed and I felt so ashamed, but I also felt that if I stayed, the shame would have been so much worse. I wouldn't be able to tolerate it.
Right.
And I would do this thing with, I grew up reading probably a couple hours of scriptures a day as a little kid, little kid.
Yeah.
And it was not driven out of that place of, I would like to be reading scriptures right now.
Yeah.
It was driven, or I'd like to be learning, or, whatever reasons people could want to read scriptures. It was not that. It was, if I don't do this, I might go to hell. If I die tonight and I missed a day, what would that mean? And I was so fixated on this idea of not going to hell, of being perfect, of not disappointing God, that I had taken these rules, which I think a lot of them are good intention. I think it's a good idea not to cuss people out or to be polite, right?
Yeah,
But it had
definitely
taken it to this extreme of, run away, or this extreme of, instead of just, it's a good idea to learn things that help you grow, you must read scriptures every day, otherwise God will be so disappointed in you and you'll go to hell, right? It just takes it to that black and white extreme. And so my upbringing in relation to the scrupulosity was just really black and white and really based in shame and a lot of guilt that is hard to, that I think contributed a lot to some CPTSD.
Yeah. And I want to talk about the complex PTSD here in a second. But for those listening, it's like the reading the Bible for hours on end. That was you ritualizing and making sure that you were running in the face of sin and being a good person in the eyes of God.
Yeah. And even just to illustrate how, extreme it can be. I remember being like 16, I was driving, and I kind of took that idea of constantly have a prayer in your heart to an extreme too, where if I wasn't praying, I'd feel guilty. And so anytime there was a silence in a conversation, I'd start praying. Anytime there was any bit of silence, I would pray. I probably prayed like 10 hours a day. And to the point where I'd be driving, and this is something I took a long time to accept. I was so embarrassed by this and I felt so much shame as I did it.
Yeah.
But I'd be driving and I'd like close my eyes periodically to pray while driving.
Yeah.
Which is just all sorts of scary.
Yeah.
But when you think that it's that or going to hell, it feels so emotional.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And anybody with OCD understands where you were coming from in that place. You know what I mean? So like, to me, it's like, of course that's what you were doing, because especially when you're that far down the rabbit hole where it's 10 hours of prayer a day, you're compulsing a lot. Like it's a constant compulsion to try to relieve the fear, the anxiety, etc.
Totally.
So that's a great piece of a story, I think, for people that they might be in that place right now.
Right.
So hearing that is so important. So you said you felt every type of genre of thought. So it went from scrupulosity to, what did it transition to again?
I mean, I've often just had many different types at the same time. And so another big one was harm. I felt really concerned with harming other people, often unintentionally. So it would be things like, what if I accidentally just hurt someone's feelings because I didn't laugh loud enough at their joke? Even just things as simple as that, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of doing compulsions of calling people and apologizing. I also felt really responsible for people's well-being, just this overinflated sense of responsibility, which meant I'd keep my phone on all night long in case a friend needed me. I had zero boundaries, people pleasing galore. That's what got me into a toxic relationship, was feeling responsible for helping him in the dark place he was in, and just kind of feeling this inflated sense of responsibility that if someone got hurt, it'd be my fault. So the best illustration of this is, there was one time I slid off the road. It was super icy, slid off the road, and it was really late at night, and I went back with a shovel and was trying to chip away at the ice on the road, because I thought if someone else slid off the road, it would be my fault. right? And so I'm
Yeah.
chipping away at the road. I started knocking on doors, asking if anyone had ice salt. I almost got hit by two cars. It
Yeah.
was a super dangerous experience, and one I was also embarrassed to tell for a long time. But again, when
Yeah.
you're in that compulsive state, it was, I either do this or I am a murderer because someone slides off the road and gets hurt and it's my fault, right?
Right. Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. I completely, again, I can picture being in that place and compulsing. And I really want to touch on the abusive relationship,
Yeah,
at some point in this conversation, because I think a lot of people that operate in that guilt and shame probably end up in that place.
totally.
And it's a cognitive distortion too, right? That
Hmm.
it's you that makes everybody around you either happy or sad or has their feelings hurt. And while, again, it gets back to that area of gray, while there is certainly some truth to that, it's not truth in its entirety, right? Like
Right,
how you
right.
behave in the world does have some impact on the people around you, but it's also on other people to make themselves happy and to
Well, it's
feel
on the
good.
city to ice the roads, not on some teenage girl, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
100%. So totally agree with that. So we had harm. What else? What?
Um, we could do relationship OCD. So, that one, as a little kid, it attached itself to my parents,
Okay.
and that meant that I was constantly looking for reassurance that they loved me. And
Mm,
just to be clear, they never gave any indication that they didn't. They
right.
were very supportive, but I still would grab onto little things. Like my dad, I tease him to this about this, but he would always say, I'd say, I love you. And he'd go, you too. And because he
Yeah.
didn't say, I love you too, my brain said that means he doesn't love you. Right. And I
Right.
would
Right.
try to say it repeatedly until he would say, that he
I
loved
love
me
you. Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
And I didn't have the words to communicate that that's what I was needing from him. And so I just felt really, really stuck and confused as a little kid.
Yeah.
And so it grabbed on to parents, also grabbed onto siblings, and then later on it grabbed onto friends and romantic relationships. So kind of hyper fixating on being in the perfect relationship,
Yeah.
which meant that it would, I would, or even just not being in a relationship at all. Like I would panic about being single, and so I would end up swiping on dating apps, dating people who maybe weren't totally suited for me, and then
Yeah.
also picking the relationship apart and having a really hard time committing because I was so petrified, and worried about trusting, and doing a lot of compulsions to make sure that it was
Yeah.
right.
What would a compulsion look like to test if the relationship was right?
Yeah, so it might be something like, that's a good question. Reading other people's experiences with their
Mm.
relationships and how it felt when they found, quote, the one,
The
reading,
one
what does that
classic.
mean, right?
Yes. My
Researching that,
soulmate.
so much research, so much just like Redditing of, hey, what does this mean? Or over analyzing texts before they sent, you know, avoiding dating altogether or dating people that weren't necessarily my, again, like super suited for me, just out of that panic and that fear.
Yeah. So let's talk quickly about the abusive relationship.
Yeah.
What was that? Was that rooted somewhat in OCD, or was that just
It was
okay?
100% OCD.
Okay.
So it kind of was those past three themes actually that we just talked about,
Yeah.
all like culminated into one. So it essentially was, um, I again grew up in a very high demand religion. He was not a member of this religion, and in my church, I was always taught to, be a good missionary and help people. And I felt responsible for other people going to hell or not.
Yeah.
It was this inflated sense of responsibility and so much fear of, if
Yeah.
I do not help this person to get into the church, they'll go to hell and that will be my fault. Right. So it was that harm OCD
Mm,
combined with the scrupulosity. And so I felt really responsible for him, really responsible for his actions, really responsible for his relationship to God, which why would you ever be responsible for someone
right.
else's relationship to anything?
Yeah.
And so hyper fixating on it, and then also just feeling so much concern about hurting him or not helping him, because he was in a really, it was very clear from the day I met him that he was in this really bad mindset. He'd
Mm,
experienced a lot of trauma and was lashing out and just not coping with it in a way that was effective. And
right.
I felt like I had to be the one to help him because I knew better, because I knew how to work through it.
Right.
Um, and so that meant that I was in this relationship where we were not good for each other. We were not suited for each other. I was not attracted to him. I wouldn't have been in this relationship for any other reason except for that I felt I had to be, because he was hurting so bad and because I had to save him. Right.
Yeah.
And it ended up being a really, really bad thing where that kind of is what helped me reach the rock bottom where I
Yeah.
eventually got diagnosed, was just how emotionally abusive that relationship was.
So, and I want you to share with whatever you're comfortable with, but I always think through the lens of my listener. And I also think that sometimes people say things that trigger something that they didn't even know that they were searching for, but maybe they needed to hear. What did high level or whatever you want to share, some of that abuse in the relationship look like?
Yeah. So a lot of it was he would give up things for my OCD. So it was
Yeah.
something like because I'm wanting to save him religiously, he would give up drinking or something that my church didn't engage in, right?
Yeah.
And then
Yep.
he would use that as a pawn of because I gave this up for you, that means you should do this.
Mm,
Or because I'm giving up, I was like, I'm saving myself for marriage. So because he's giving that up, I should at least like
do
stay
this.
over and like stay
Yeah.
in his bed, or like there's
Right.
all sorts of little like, at least because I'm giving so much. And I kept saying, I'm not asking you to give these things. I never asked him to give up anything. I prayed that he would, but I never asked him to.
Right.
And again, I was not in a healthy mindset with this either, but there was a lot of just feeling really manipulated into
Mm,
situations. And one day he, and trying to cut off family, being like, let's not go visit your family,
right.
and saying things, and also trying to cut off religion from me. So saying things like, oh, you shouldn't place God before me. Like I should come
Mm,
first. So that means if you're choosing between me and something religious, you should always choose me. And so just kind
mm,
of dissecting those other areas of my life that were fulfilling to me. So family, religion, friends, and saying I wasn't allowed to engage with those. You aren't allowed to be around your guy friends, or any party situation. If it's called a party, even though we were like playing Uno, you can't be there. You have to, just kind of dissecting everything
yeah.
until it was just him that was in my life, and
Mm, he was
demanding,
controlling.
very controlling, and we were lived an hour away, and it was always me who would visit him because he had given up so much for me, right? So I
Mm,
think that it's really important to talk about what emotional abuse looks like, because it can be really sneaky at first. A
yeah.
lot of the time his words were manipulative, where it was like, yeah, that makes sense why I shouldn't go to this party. And other times I just, I knew that what he was saying was wrong, but again, that hyper inflated sense of responsibility because of the OCD meant that I stuck around and had to help. Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring that up because it seems like maybe there were some narcissistic components there because
Yeah.
I've heard this in other relationships, and being like overly controlling is always one of those kind of key components where it's like, as soon as you get home, I want you to FaceTime me. I need to see that
Yeah.
you're in your room, that
Right.
you are where you're telling me, like those types of things. I've heard that a lot, and that can become emotionally exhausting, I'm sure, as it was for
Totally.
you. So it drove you to rock bottom. How did you know you were at rock bottom? And how did you then begin the journey of receiving the diagnosis?
Totally. Um, yeah, so I remember talking to my dad and just being like, I can't seem to do the things that everyone else can do. I
Hmm.
told him, I was like, I've Googled how do you clean your room, probably 800 times. I experienced, those are some of my main subtypes, but again, I experienced lots. So contamination OCD was one, and it was so overwhelming, and perfectionism. So it was so overwhelming to clean my room perfectly that I wouldn't clean it at all.
Let's talk perfectionism just real quick.
Yeah.
How does that manifest itself in OCD?
Yeah, so perfectionism is what it sounds like. It's anything that you're doing with the intention of being perfect. So it might be you're trying to do your hobby perfectly, your homework perfectly, your academic performance. It might be trying to make your external surroundings look perfect, your desk, your outfit, right? Or it might be trying to make yourself be perceived as perfect in social situations, which is exhausting.
Right.
And I experienced kind of all of the above. Like there was so much perfectionism that went into everything, to the point where I was an Irish dancer taking first in state, and then I started taking second in state. And suddenly my entire sense of identity was gone and shattered. And I didn't know how to cope, to the point where I was spraining my ankle a lot, and was, I think, using that as a way to bow out. I almost feel like I was on purposely spraining my ankle because I couldn't cope with the idea of being second, of being imperfect, right? And a lot of the time I knew this was irrational, and so I'd feel guilty for it. I'd feel like I shouldn't be jealous of this girl who got first. Like, she worked really hard, probably harder than I did, like it shouldn't be that big of a thing, but it was. And so that played into everything. And especially, even just simple things like cleaning my room, where I had to do it this perfect way. And I would pull everything off all the shelves and put it in the middle of the room, and then get so overwhelmed that I wouldn't even start. And so there was lots of times where I actually, as a 13-year-old, I was almost diagnosed with OCD. And then they were like, oh, you have a messy room, never mind. Right. When in reality, that's because of the OCD that I had a messy room.
It's interesting that you say that, because getting back to quote unquote the larger society and people who don't have OCD, like I see those components with people too, where it's like they want to get started on something. They want to get started on that passion project. They want to get started on career advancement. They want to get started on that art project. They want to get started on planning that trip. And like, it's almost like all the things in the middle of your room, like, to use that analogy, They look at it and they're like, oh my God, I don't even know where to start. I'm just walking away from this.
Right. Well, and that pairs up with ADHD often too.
There you go.
And makes it even harder to accomplish anything. That's definitely something I've experienced, where there's so much criteria for doing it right, or even okay. And because you struggle to get anything done, because with the ADHD, with the executive dysfunction, it can just feel like a huge pile in the middle of your room that you can't combat.
Exactly. Well, that's even why I had perfectionism as a child, and it basically rendered me completely. So it was funny because it showed up in sports. I could not make a mistake in sports. So when I played the game, and my poor mother, she pleaded with me. She tried every incentive in the book, especially around basketball, to just get me to go out there and play loose. Play free, play open, play accepting, like all the concepts that we're talking about now. And I just couldn't do it, because I was always playing from a place of fear, because I was more fearful about making a mistake than I was about playing the game. And it wasn't honestly until I graduated from college and started reading some personal development books, which I have thoughts on personal development. I think it can be very beneficial. I also think it, just like anything else, it can be taken to an extreme, but progress over perfection became my motto. And that's literally just how I operate now. It's all about process and progress. Like, if there's a goal I want to achieve, I put a healthy process around it, something that's not going to drive me into the ground. And I just kind of say to myself, I'm going to work this process for a while, and it's not going to be perfect. And I'm going to see if I'm making any progress. If I am, great, to get closer to that goal. If not, is there anything that I need to tweak in the process? Or is it possible, not to go off on a tangent, but is it possible, just like with 15-year-old Zach, who had a guitar sit in the corner of his room for 4 years because he wanted to learn how to play the guitar, but did he really love music, or was he trying to impress
Right.
girls?
Right.
So he had the wrong goal entirely.
Right.
Is this a sign that I really just need to change what the target is? Like, am I just aiming at the wrong target? Like, okay, I've learned how to play Wonderwall because it's 3 chords and it's a song that everybody starts with, but I actually hate playing this instrument. Or is it one of those deals where I just need to tweak the process? But when I went to process and progress over perfection, gosh, my life changed so much.
I love that.
So
and
much.
I think it's important to illustrate here there's a difference between adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive or OCD levels of perfectionism. Because I think when I paint, that was one area that my OCD never grabbed onto. I used to think that it did because it was the most stereotypical perception of it. But when I'm painting, I want my painting to look perfect, but when I say perfect, it really just means I want it to look like the vision in my head, and so I'll work to make it that way, but it's not driven out of fear or shame. It's excitement. I can't wait to make this vision a reality. That's right. Cool. And that can be really helpful and really a beautiful process. But when it becomes maladaptive is when it's like I can't move forward because of the distress that I'm feeling, right? I'm starting to avoid it. And that was the level I'd hit where, you know, I'm having this conversation with my dad and I'm saying, I can't clean my room. I can't go to school. I can't leave my apartment. I had developed, you know, a lot of disordered eating, like an eating disorder from the OCD. I was just like sick. And I also had chronic illness. I'd reached this point where I didn't know how to do those basic activities of daily living. You know, it took so much effort to do something as simple as showering, and I just felt completely stuck. And unsure who I was. And that's when as I was talking with my dad, I had this thought come to my brain that was, you have OCD. And that's something I'd heard doctors say, but it was more of the, no, you don't, because of cleanliness. But I had that thought and I was like, I want to look into this a little bit more. And I got this workbook, and I don't know where that thought came from. I don't know exactly what spurred that on, but I got this workbook. And I read through, some examples of intrusive thoughts and some examples of compulsions. And I just started sobbing. And it was a lot of intrusive thoughts that I'd felt so ashamed of forever and had no context for. Even things like POCD, or pedophilic OCD, where it's, random intrusive thoughts about what if you're wanting to do this with a kid, or, just horrible intrusive thoughts that I had shoved away and felt so confused by and so repulsed by. And being able to acknowledge this is OCD and now I can accept it and now I can move forward meant that I could get started with the ERP process.
It's funny that you talk about looking up the signs and symptoms. My first Google search when I was trapped. At this point, I was severely anxious, deeply depressed, thoughts of suicide, moment I wake up, moment I go to bed. I'm calling my mother compulsively looking for reassurance. And my first Google search was, why am I scared to be gay? Because I was having sexually intrusive thoughts about my orientation. I'd always identified as straight. And I was like I can't, the harder I try to stop these thoughts, the louder that they're getting in my head. Why is this causing me so much fear? And it was just boom. And I mean, thank God for Google, because it was just every link I clicked, I'm reading it, and I'm reading the one that finally tipped it over for me when I was like, wow, this is OCD, and I can't even remember his name now. He was a man that identified as gay. And he had OCD. His fear was around being straight.
Right.
And I was like, wait, what? This is a thing? I didn't even know that people, so I was and of course my thoughts morph just like everybody else's, but it's what my therapist said. Once you know the formula and the playbook to dealing with it, it does not matter. You don't have to ever fear a thought again. You just run the same playbook. Yeah,
the content does not matter. Yeah,
nope.
It doesn't matter if you have one theme or 2,000, if you have all the ones I've had or not, it's the same thing. It's the same and like not tolerating the distress to the point where you do things to neutralize it.
Right. Exactly. So then on that note, so you get diagnosed. What is the treatment plan?
Yeah. So I started an intensive outpatient program with ERP. I did ERP and DBT, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, where you talk about things like that, radical acceptance. We talked about all of that. And and that's something we bring into our support groups at NOCD. We try to, we focus on the ERP. That's the bulk of it, right?
Yeah.
Not all DBT skills help ERP, but we talk about the ones that do in support groups, and we try to make that a space. So it's fun to be able to give back in that way.
What skills help with DBT? What are the one or from DBT? Which ones help?
So, I mean, the radical acceptance is really great, right? The wave, the idea of leaning in toward the distress. Some interpersonal effectiveness can be really useful.
What does that mean?
That's just kind of the way we communicate. So that's finding ways to communicate, boundary setting, learning all of those skills can be really, really helpful. I teach a interpersonal effectiveness and boundary setting group at NOCD, where we kind of go over how to set boundaries, especially when you're coming from the perspective of someone who used to be a people pleaser or used to have that hyper responsibility or is experiencing that.
How do you set healthy boundaries?
That's a whole thing.
Do you have like a high level, like here are the 3 bullet points?
Yeah. The 3, so this template works a lot of the time. I won't say, I don't have a percentage, but a lot of the time. And obviously it depends on your intention with setting the boundary. Is your intention to like create a deeper bond in the relationship and to continue the relationship, right? That might be appropriate for a spouse, right? Or is your intention to get an objective done? Is it to get a raise, right? Or is your intention self-respect? Is it just setting this clear space for you, right? Your intention matters, and that determines how you set the boundary. But kind of the
intention's important, y'all.
Intention is so vital. And once you recognize the intention, it's easier to know how to communicate effectively, because most communication issues happen because people have different intentions, right? Someone is so focused on you need to do the dishes that they're missing that their priority is actually their relationship. And there's maybe a different way they could still accomplish the same goal while focusing on the relationship.
I feel like you might be talking to me, Tia. That's a theme in our relationship.
Is it?
It is, and we've had a lot of conversations around it. My wife hates sponges, hates them, compulsed by them, like just or repulsed, I should say. And so I find myself doing the majority of the dishes, which not too long ago I think frustrated me, and we've had some conversations, so we're in a good place with it at the moment. But that was that example was like, that brings out some conversations for me and the intention behind it. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
Whenever you acknowledge what the intention is and focus on, you want to have a good relationship, that's the bottom line here. How can we make it a safe place to have these boundaries? That changes the discussion. If you're just focused on who's doing the dishes, you're not going to be focused on the relationship, right?
And that was something that I learned through those conversations. I don't think that I was coming from a place of love and compassion and the right intentions and being more open. It was more like, this is what you need to do at the start. And I think that those conversations evolved. So that is,
totally.
I relate to that, and I appreciate you kind of sharing that.
Well, and that's what we talk a lot about in that group is what's the intention, and then how do we go about setting it? And so depending on the intention, the format does change, but kind of the one I really like to go back to is the idea of thanking, expressing gratitude, setting the boundary, and then reinforcing the relationship. When you do it in that layer, it can be really helpful. So that looks like, maybe a friend asks you on a date and it's thank you for asking. I'd really like to, I'm not interested. No. Can we still be friends? Right. Yeah. It's the thank you. Here's the boundary, reinforce the relationship to whatever extent you want the relationship to be. That doesn't mean you have to be friends. It might look totally different. Right.
Right.
But setting that can be really helpful. So let's say, a church organization asks you to volunteer your time to do something. and you care about the church organization, it's something you're passionate about, but you do not have the time to do it.
Right.
You're busy. So you might say, thank you so much for thinking about me. That sounds like a really cool project. The boundary might be, I actually am only, taking paid clients right now because I have such a busy schedule. And then the reinforcing the relationship might be, but here are some resources that might be a good starting place. You can maybe show, here's a video, or here's a couple good websites or links that have really been helpful to me, right? Giving what you're able to give, and reinforcing the relationship, basically saying, I still care about what you're doing. Here's what I can do right now. And that format works with so many situations. Like if you use that structure, it can be really helpful. I don't know. Do you have an example of a boundary setting situation? I can walk through those three.
No, that I loved that example. I thought that was really applicable even for me, because as a speaker, I get people reaching out all the time. They want me to come speak for free, and like,
right.
It is like, oh my gosh, I care so much about this work and the people, and I love your organization, but I live on the West Coast and you are a 6-hour flight, and I've done that flight 24 times this year, and it's exhausting, and I get jet lag, and it messes with my brain health if I'm not careful. And so I have to create boundaries.
And that's, I think sometimes people think that boundaries mean you don't care. Exactly. That's not the case at all. Right. Like, you can care so much about the mission, and you can care so much about wanting to give back, and still it might not align with you. And so there's ways to still give what you can. And it might be as simple as a link. It might be, here's someone else you could call. It might just be, maybe I'll have time next week. Right. But we can still give to whatever extent we can and reinforce the relationship without compromising our own needs and boundaries.
I love that so much. So I'm looking at the time. We've gone way over the 45 minutes, but I've just been loving this conversation. So for people listening, and I know obviously there are other episodes that talk about ERP, but that's exposure and response prevention. Do you have any thoughts on kind of the best practices behind how to get the most out of ERP?
Really just let your doubts be there and lean in. If you stand there trying to figure out whether it's going to be good for you, and you're trying to figure out if it's the right thing or if you're engaging in it the right way, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to start moving your feet, and you can always readjust later on. You might be like, actually, I did end up engaging in compulsion. I didn't know that. Next time I'll do better. But if you sit there trying to figure it out, you're inevitably going to be engaging in compulsion. So let the doubts be there. Let yourself, it's scary. It's hard to invest in things like that, right? But then lean in. And one thing that I think is just so helpful is reducing shame in any way you can, letting yourself, acknowledge that this is your experience. And I think one of the best ways to do that is community support, finding people who have that experience, who you can talk to, and it kind of hear someone else say you're the intrusive thought that you've always been ashamed of. Hearing someone else say that out loud is such a freeing experience. And so that's one of the things I love to see in our support groups is people who are coming, sharing their story, and then hearing someone else share the same story that you've experienced in a way that can just be so liberating. And so the more community support you can get, the better. And I feel so glad to work for an OCD where that's one of our main focuses.
So with that in mind, are there any resources, books, podcasts, websites that you recommend people that are kind of connecting the dots or already have OCD and that's why they clicked on this episode can check out?
Yeah. So NOCD has, our app is free. Our website is free. We do a lot of blog posts talking about it, and just reels and TikToks and all of these fun things that where you're able to get more content and understanding for what you're experiencing. We have kind of like a community app where you can talk to other people. And then when it comes to, other websites, I post a lot of resources on my blog, tiawilson.org. That's always a good place to go. I always encourage finding advocates in the community. There's just so many people who are talking about this. It might feel really isolating, but as soon as you get in the rabbit hole on Instagram of advocates who are chatting, it's pretty amazing how many people are dedicating so much time to this. So kind of scoping out those spaces, I do a lot of advocacy on Instagram too. If you just go, I have a highlight where I talk about some of my fellow advocates and some of the work they're doing. So that can be a good way to get started with the advocacy, and finding more voices and understanding. And we could do a whole episode on all the good books too. But
yes, definitely. And maybe I'll link a few of those in the show notes.
Yeah.
What is, kind of to wrap things up, what is one piece of advice that you would give someone who is at the start of their mental health journey right now?
Yeah. Trust the process. Whenever you're changing your brain, it's going to be uncomfortable. Our brains are used to what they're used to. And so it's going to be a process before you make a new default. I always give the example of your brain is like a canyon that's been formed after all these years. And here you are, like chiseling away this new little path that you would like the water to go. And you might have to redirect the water every single day, every single time at first, but eventually that little chiseled pathway you're making will turn into its own canyon, right? But for a while, it might feel very hands-on. You might be really just in it, and it might be hard to trust the process because your default will still be that canyon for a while. Just know that your brain is uncomfortable with all changes. That doesn't mean they're bad. Good changes are uncomfortable too. And so lean into the process and trust the time.
You have given some unbelievable analogies on this podcast.
I love analogies.
Yes, and the canyon is too, it's just, I can picture it. You're so right. I mean, it's just the rainwater and everything else has formed. The neural pathways, they're set in their way, and now you kind of have to go in there and chisel it out and direct that water down that new path. And at first, it takes a lot of effort, but it's, to use another analogy, it's just like going to the gym. If you're going to build muscle, you just have to work that muscle over and over and over again. And with time and trusting that process, you can transform whatever muscle group you're looking to transform. So
totally.
So relatable. And Tia, I just really appreciate you coming on. I'm so glad that we were connected, and thank you for being an open book and sharing your story. I think that it's really relatable. It's powerful. I think a lot of the concepts that you're talking about are applicable for everyone, regardless of whether you have OCD or not. And so I appreciate you having a voice, being willing to open up and share, because you just never know who you're impacting.
Yeah, thank you. It's been so fun to be able to chat with you.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to bring you on for another pod. It seems like there are many other...
we could keep talking.
Definitely, definitely. Well, I appreciate you coming on to the podcast. I look forward to future conversations with you, and you're not alone, of course.
Thank you. Awesome.
Okay, I'm just stopping these recordings.